In a world filled with noise, sometimes the most important voices go unheard. This is the story of Sophie, who found her strength in silence and learned that every voice, no matter how quiet, has the power to make a difference. In the midst of a bustling high school, where every hallway hums with chatter and laughter, Sophie felt like a ghost. She wasn't shy or without thoughts. She just didn't believe her voice mattered. Sitting in the back of the classroom, she watched as others raised their hands, eager to share their opinions, while she stayed silent, hoping not to be noticed. Lunchtime was no different. Surrounded by conversations she wasn't a part of, Sophie found solace in the quiet company of her own thoughts, scribbling in her journals as the world around her seemed to move on without her. Her journal was Sophie's escape, a safe place where she could pour out everything she felt without fear of judgment. It wasn't just a collection of words. It was her heart on paper. Every day, she filled its pages with reflections on self-doubt, her wish to speak up, and the small details of life that others might overlook. But those thoughts remained hidden, locked away between the lines, because Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that her voice, like her presence, was invisible. One afternoon, as Sophie sat quietly in class, something happened that made her heart ache. A fellow student, vulnerable and brave, shared a personal story, only to be met with laughter and mockery. Sophie's hand hovered in the air, wanting to speak up, to defend the student. But the words never came. She felt a sting of guilt, a deep longing to be the voice that others couldn't be. That night, in the solitude of her room, Sophie's frustration spilled into her journal. "Why do I always stay quiet when I could help?" she wrote, searching for an answer. Then, one night, as Sophie pondered her silent frustration, an idea began to form. A way to speak out without the fear of being judged. What if she didn't need to be face to face with anyone to make a difference? What if she could use her voice, hidden behind the screen, to share her thoughts with the world? And so, The Invisible Voice was born. A podcast where Sophie could finally speak, not as a silent observer, but as someone who had something to say. In the quiet of her bedroom, Sophie set up her phone and wrapped herself in a blanket, creating a makeshift studio to record her first episode. In her first episode, Sophie opened up about a moment she had never shared before, a time when she had felt completely alone at school. She talked about how silence can feel safe, but it also creates a barrier between you and the world. She spoke honestly, with no pretenses. Just a simple message at the end. Your voice matters, even if you think no one is listening. Sophie had no idea if anyone would hear, but it was the first time in a long while that she felt her words meant something. To Sophie's surprise, her podcast found an audience. She started receiving messages from people who felt the same way she did, people who had been waiting for someone to say what they couldn't. One email in particular stood out. "I feel invisible too. Thank you for saying what I couldn't." It was a small message, but it was enough to keep Sophie going. As more students listened, Sophie's voice grew stronger, and with each new episode she shared more stories of self-doubt, small acts of bravery, and how the quietest voices can make the biggest impact. As her podcast gained traction, Sophie began to notice something unexpected. The students who once ignored her in the hallways now smiled as she passed. She heard whispers of her podcast in the cafeteria, and some of her classmates started reaching out to her, not knowing she was the invisible voice. It was like the world around her was slowly waking up to the fact that Sophie had something valuable to say. And one day, a classmate approached her, sharing a personal story and seeking advice, still unaware that Sophie was the voice they'd been listening to. Sophie's heart swelled with a sense of connection she had never known before. The day came when Sophie stood in front of her school at an assembly, her heart racing in her chest. She had kept her identity hidden for so long, but now it was time to share the truth. As she took the microphone, her hands trembled, but her voice, once uncertain, now rang clear and steady. "I was scared to speak up," Sophie confessed, "but I learned that every voice, even an invisible one, has the power to inspire." In that moment, Sophie realized she had done more than find her own voice. She had inspired others to find theirs too. She smiled, knowing that her words would echo in the hearts of those who had felt invisible just like her.